Snow had been falling since before daybreak, fine as sifted flour and just as relentless, blanketing the northern frontier in a silence that felt heavy enough to crush the bones. By late afternoon, the drifts had swallowed half the split-rail fence that circled the lonely homestead. The cold was the sort that settled deep in the marrow, the kind no fire could truly chase away once it took hold. Inside the small, hewn log cabin, My Lin sat beside the hearth. She was 25, widowed long before her time, her delicate frame wrapped in a high-collared, padded cheongsam of deep crimson silk. It was a garment of celebration, embroidered with golden phoenixes that shimmered in the firelight, a stark, vibrant contrast to the rough timber walls and the howling wilderness outside. She wore it today because it was Christmas Eve, and also her birthday, though the date felt less like a milestone and more like a scar. Her hands were wrapped around a tin cup of tea that had gone cold. The flames flickered against her pale face, illuminating the shadows of sleeplessness under her almond-shaped eyes. She had not slept truly well in months, not since the day the cavalry officer rode in with a folded flag and the news that her husband, Henry, had fallen in a border skirmish far from home. Today should have been a day of joy. She remembered how Henry would polish the small mirror on the wall every year on this day, his blue eyes crinkling with a smile as he told her she was the only light he needed. But there were no gifts now. No heavy bootsteps crunching on the snow outside. No laughter. No warmth. Just the wind, the snow, and a silence too vast for any young widow to carry alone. My Lin rose from her chair, the silk of her cheongsam whispering against her legs. She walked to the single small window and brushed a layer of frost from the glass. Beyond it lay a world of white emptiness, a void that made a person feel insignificant. It was the kind of night where no one would come knocking. She reached for a candle, set it in the window, a habit from her childhood, meant to guide wandering spirits or lost travelers home on the holy night. She did not expect it to mean anything tonight, in this desolate territory where she was the only one of her kind for miles. She lit it anyway. Minutes dragged into an hour. My Lin drifted between memories she tried and failed to bury. Henry's voice. His promise, next Christmas, we'll fill this place with music and maybe the patter of little feet, a promise broken by a bullet and bad luck. And then, thud, thud, thud. A hard, urgent knocking shook the heavy oak door. My Lin flinched so sharply she nearly dropped her cup. She froze, her heart thundering against her ribs. No one came out here in a storm like this unless something terrible had happened. Another knock came, louder this time. The wind howled through the chinks in the logs, pushing fine powder under the door. My Lin reached for the rifle hanging above the mantel, more for courage than intent. She smoothed the front of her dress, stepped to the door, and called out, her voice trembling. "Who is there?" A voice, strained and hoarse, answered through the roaring wind. "Please. I need shelter." My Lin hesitated. The frontier was dangerous, and a woman alone was a target. But there was a desperation in the tone that tugged at the instincts her grandmother had taught her, that to deny a traveler was to deny fate. She unbolted the door. It flew inward with the violence of the storm, and a blast of snow struck her full in the face. Through the white swirl stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a worn buffalo hide coat coated in ice. His hat was pulled low, his dark hair frozen at the ends. His lips were blue, his breath ragged, but his eyes, dark, sharp, and startlingly handsome, held exhaustion mixed with a plea for mercy. He rasped. "I won't trouble you long. I only ask for a fire to keep me alive until the storm eases." My Lin's instincts warred within her. She should refuse. But as she looked at him, she saw a shadow of the exhaustion Henry used to carry after a long patrol. "Come in," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Before you freeze solid." He stepped inside, stamping the snow from his heavy boots. She shut the door hard behind him, sealing out the cold and throwing the heavy iron bolt. The man stood uncertainly near the hearth, snow melting from his buffalo coat into dark puddles on the floorboards. He looked at the fire as if unsure he deserved its warmth. My Lin set her rifle aside, though she kept it within reach. She poured a fresh cup of hot water from the kettle. "It is all I have ready right now." I wasn't planning a feast. He smiled faintly as he wrapped his large, calloused hands around the cup. Thank you. I'm Grant. His voice was deeper than she expected, gentle, low, carrying the cadence of a man who spent his life talking to horses and watching the horizon. You can stay, Mai Lin said, adjusting the high collar of her dress. Until the snow lets up. Grant looked at her for a long moment. The firelight caught the strong line of his jaw and the quiet gratitude in his gaze. He seemed to take in the strange sight of her, a woman in a red silk gown in the middle of a blizzard, surrounded by rough-hewn timber. If I could choose, he said softly, I'd stay longer than that. It's been a long time since I've seen a home. Mai Lin blinked, startled by the warmth rising to her face. She turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with the iron kettle. I suppose, she murmured, this Christmas Eve won't be so lonely after all. She carved what was left of a roasted chicken, a bird she had meant to stretch for days, and set it between them on the small table. Grant hesitated before taking a piece, as though unused to being welcomed at any table not his own. The wind beat against the walls, but inside, the fire glowed, turning the shadows into golden pools of quiet comfort. Grant ate slowly, savoring each bite. Mai Lin watched him, curiosity stirring through her grief like a spark under wet ashes. He ate like a man who knew hunger well. After a while, Grant spoke, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. You have a soldier's flag on the mantel. You lost someone. Mai Lin set her fork down, her throat tightening. My husband, she whispered. Just a few months ago. He was only 30-inch. Grant's gaze lowered. A flicker of pain crossed his eyes, a shadow she did not understand. I'm sorry, he said. A man should grow old beside the woman he loves. She swallowed hard. We didn't get the chance. Grant stared into the flames, his jaw tense, as though he carried ghosts of his own. Sometimes, he murmured, those we lose guide us in ways we don't expect. Mai Lin frowned slightly. You say that like you know. Grant lifted his eyes to hers. They were full of secrets, full of something he wasn't ready to speak. Maybe I do, he said. Outside, the storm raged, burying the world. Inside, for the first time in months, Mai Lin felt the faint stirrings of warmth, not just from the fire, but from the presence of the stranger who had come knocking on the loneliest night of her life. Mai Lin woke the next morning to a stillness so complete she thought for a disoriented moment that the world outside had frozen in time. The cabin was warm, warmer than she remembered leaving it. Something smelled savory and comforting. She blinked sleep from her eyes, pushed aside the heavy wool blanket, and stepped into the main room. Grant was there, already awake, already working. He stood over the cast-iron pot on the stove, steam curling around his face. He had shed the heavy buffalo coat, revealing a simple flannel shirt and suspenders. He turned at the sound of her soft footsteps. A gentle smile lit his features, softening the hard lines carved by wind and work. Morning, he said. I hope you don't mind. I found the chicken bones from last night. Thought I'd turn them into soup. Added some dried sage I found in the jar. Mai Lin stopped in the doorway for a heartbeat, stunned. It wasn't just that he was cooking. It was the domesticity of it. Grant standing there, stirring a pot at dawn. The smell of warm broth filling the cabin. It was too familiar. Too tender. Her voice wavered. You remind me of him. My husband. He used to wake early and she stopped, the memory pressing too sharp against her ribs. He used to cook breakfast. Grant's smile softened into something deeper, understanding, perhaps, or shared sorrow. Then maybe, he said quietly, he brought me here. Mai Lin looked up sharply. What do you mean? Grant shrugged one broad shoulder, stirring the broth with slow, sure movements. Some men love so strong, it doesn't end when their breath does. Sometimes it pushes the living along paths they never meant to take. Mai Lin wrapped her arms around herself, the silk of her robe cool against her skin. You talk like you've lost someone, too. His hand stilled on the wooden spoon. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, he said, "Everyone loses someone. Some losses carve deeper than others." She didn't press. Something in his voice warned her that pushing might crack open wounds far older than hers. The soup began to bubble. Grant ladled a portion into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers, warm and calloused. "Eat," he said. "It'll help." Mylin lowered herself to the table. The first sip burned her tongue, but its warmth spread through her chest like a small sun. Grant sat across from her with his own bowl. The snowlight spilled through the frosted window, pale and blue, casting them both in a quiet glow. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "The soup." "For being here. I didn't think anyone would knock on my door again." Grant looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "I'm glad I did." They ate in a hush, broken only by the wind brushing against the cabin walls. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was the calm that settles after a storm has cried out its worst. When they finished, Grant carried the bowls to the wash basin. Mylin watched him, her heart tugging in ways that frightened her. She shouldn't feel this lightness, this flicker of hope. Not yet. Not so soon. But Grant, with his quiet hands and gentle eyes, made the loneliness in her chest shift in a way she hadn't expected. "If you've got chores," he said, drying his hands, "I can lend a hand. I run a ranch a few days' ride south of here. I know my way around a shovel and an axe." "You don't have to," she said automatically. "I know," he replied. "But I want to." So she handed him a shovel, and together they worked through the morning, clearing snow from the porch and digging a path to the woodshed. Grant moved with smooth, practiced motions, strong as a man used to hard miles and harsher winters. When he smiled, rare, quiet, honest, it made the cold seem less biting. By midday, the sky had brightened enough to show the range of hills beyond the cabin. A band of deer picked its way along the ridge. Grant paused to watch them, the wind tugging strands of his dark hair. "You have a beautiful place," he murmured. Mylin followed his gaze. "It was supposed to be our beginning," she whispered. "Mine and Henry's." Grant didn't look away from the hills. Beginnings take many forms. She felt heat rise in her chest, not anger, not grief, but something gentler and terrifying. Inside again, they warmed their hands by the stove. Grant leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely over his chest. The firelight painted him in amber hues. "Do you miss him every day?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "But some days hurt more than others." Grant nodded slowly. "And today?" She hesitated, her heart stumbling. "Today hurts less." She saw his breath catch only slightly, but enough to notice. And when their eyes met, something unspoken moved between them, fragile as a snowflake, dangerous as a spark. The afternoon slipped into evening. They prepared supper together, bumping elbows, sharing small smiles. When Grant reached over her to grab a spice jar, his arm brushed her shoulder. She didn't step away. Later, they sat beside the fireplace. A lamp glowed on the table. Grant stretched his legs, boots crossed at the ankles, looking more at ease than he had since arriving. "Where were you headed before the storm?" Mylin asked. He considered the question long enough that she worried he'd refuse to answer. "North," he said finally. "Trying to keep a promise." "What kind of promise?" Grant's gaze drifted to the fire. For a heartbeat, he looked carved from sorrow. "The kind a man doesn't break," he said. "Even if it costs him." She felt a shiver pass through her. There was a secret in him, a truth curled like a sleeping animal under his ribs. And though she didn't yet know what it was, she felt deep in her bones that when it surfaced, it would change everything. But tonight, beside the fire, with the storm quieting outside and their hearts beating closer than either intended, she let the secret stay where it was. Because Grant was smiling at her? And for the first time since burying her husband, Mylin felt alive. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world outside washed in blinding white. The drifts piled waist-deep around the cabin, and every branch glittered under a sun that felt too cold to warm anything but the soul. Inside, however, life had fallen into a quiet rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Grant brought in wood each morning, shaking snow from his shoulders as he crossed the threshold. Mylin cooked small meals, simple things, broth and bread, and the last of the dried apples. Sometimes she caught him watching her, his gaze soft, almost reverent, as though he were memorizing every movement. She didn't mind it. She didn't fear it. Not anymore. Something warm had settled between them, an unspoken thread woven from shared mornings, quiet laughter, and the way their hands brushed without pulling away. But fragile things have a way of shattering the moment one believes they are safe. It happened late in the afternoon. Mylin was tidying the cabin while Grant chopped wood outside. A ribbon of sunlight slipped across the floorboards, warming her bare feet as she moved about the room. She lifted Grant's buffalo hide coat from a chair, meaning to hang it near the stove so it wouldn't remain damp. The coat was heavier than she expected. As she shook it out, something thumped against the inside lining, a soft, folded weight. Curious, she reached into the inner pocket. Her fingers brushed paper. Old paper, creased, worn, stiff with age. Mylin frowned and pulled it free. A letter. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. Henry. Her husband's script, steady, slanted just so, the way he wrote when he hurried but still wanted the lines to look neat for her sake. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The edges were worn, the creases deep, as though it had been opened and closed many times on a long, hard trail. The words blurred for a moment before they sharpened, cutting straight into her chest. Grant, my old friend. If you are reading this, then I did not make it home. I ask you, as my brother in everything but blood, go to my wife. Don't leave her to face this world alone. She is strong, but even strong hearts break. Take care of her. Help her live the life I won't be there to give. I trust you more than any man. Henry. A coldness spread through her, colder than any wind outside. Her legs weakened, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter fluttering in her hands. The room dimmed around her, the fire's crackle fading into a dull roar in her ears. Grant knew Henry. Grant knew him well enough to be entrusted with this, the sacred, unbearable request. Grant had come here because of her husband. Not because fate had carried him to her door. Not because he chose her. He was a rancher on a mission, fulfilling a debt to a dead man. The realization tore through her chest with a sharp, bitter edge. The door opened behind her, letting in a rush of crisp air. Snow fell from Grant's boots as he stepped inside, rubbing warmth back into his hands. Chilly out there, he said, shaking stray flakes from his hair. But the path to the creek is clear now. We'll have fresh water again. Mylin didn't move. Didn't speak. She held the letter like a blade. Grant noticed her silence and paused. His brow furrowed. My? Everything all right? She lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he flinched. Because there was no warmth in her gaze now. No trust. Only hurt. You knew him, she whispered. You knew Henry. Grant froze where he stood, all color draining from his face. His eyes darted to the paper in her hand. Mylin, he breathed, his voice tight. She stood, holding the letter out toward him. You came here because of this, her voice cracked. Not because of me. Grant's jaw clenched. He stepped forward instinctively, but she recoiled as though the very sight of him burned. I meant to tell you, he said quickly. I meant to. When, she demanded, tears springing to her eyes. When were you going to tell me? After you won my trust? After you shared my bed? After I gave you pieces of myself I didn't even know how to give again. Grant shut his eyes, shoulders sagging. I never meant to lie to you. You lied the moment you walked through that door, she shot back. His voice broke. What we have, it's real. Real? Her laughter came out like a sob. How can anything be real when it began with a lie? When you were following orders from a dead man. Grant stepped closer again, his face raw with emotion. I loved him. Henry was my friend. I tried to save him. I failed. And the last thing he asked of me was to care for you. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being a promise and became something else. Something I didn't expect. Something I couldn't stop. Her throat tightened. I can't. She shook her head, tears spilling fast now. I can't look at you without seeing what you hid from me. Grant swallowed hard. Please. Just let me explain. No, the word snapped through the cabin like a whip. She pointed to the door. Pack your things. Leave my house. Grant stood there, breathing hard, as though the world had struck him square in the chest. My Lynn, I love you. Get out, she whispered. Before I start to hate you. Something in him broke. She saw the moment his heart folded under the weight of his own guilt. He gathered his few belongings in silence, each movement slow, deliberate, painful. He put on the heavy buffalo coat, concealing the flannel shirt that had become so familiar. When he reached the door, he hesitated. Snow whirled behind him, the wind tugging at his coat. Under his breath, barely audible, he murmured, Henry. I'm sorry I couldn't keep your promise. Then he stepped out into the cold. The door shut behind him with a hollow finality that echoed through every beam of the small cabin. And my Lynn, standing alone with the letter trembling in her hand, felt her heart break for the second time in one lifetime. The hours after Grant left passed like slow-moving ghosts, shapeless, cold, unwilling to leave her be. Snow blew hard against the windows, rattling the panes, but the cabin felt colder than the storm outside. My Lynn sat on the edge of her bed, the letter still in her trembling hands. She read it once more, hoping, praying it might say something different this time. But the ink did not change. Help her live the life I won't be there to give. Take care of her. She crushed the paper against her chest, as if trying to push the words back into the past where they belonged. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Why had Henry chosen Grant? Why had Grant said nothing? Why had she let herself fall for a man carrying another man's promise? Grief and anger tangled inside her until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The cabin felt unfamiliar without Grant's presence, the lingering echo of his footsteps, the memory of his low laugh, the chair he always pulled closer to the fire. She stared at the empty space where he had stood. Night fell early. A thick, electric darkness pressed against the walls. The storm had picked up again by sundown. My Lynn tried to busy herself, mending a torn hem on her cheongsam, sweeping the floor, feeding the fire, but every chore only reminded her of him. Of the way he had moved around her kitchen like he'd lived there all his life. Of the warmth his presence brought. She forced herself into bed, but sleep would not come. The wind howled like a wounded thing. Shadows crawled across the walls. Her thoughts twisted back to the morning she first saw Grant, half frozen on her porch, asking only for a place to warm his bones. She'd opened her door because of mercy. Nothing more. So how had mercy become longing? How had longing become love? Her fist tightened around the blanket. He lied, she whispered into the dark. He lied to me. But another voice rose underneath the anger. He also loved you. He tried to tell you. He didn't stay because of a promise. He stayed because of you. She rolled onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow. The scent of pine smoke and something distinct, leather and sage, clung to the fabric. Grant scent. It broke her completely. A sob tore from her chest. Then another. She hadn't cried like this even when Henry died. Maybe because then, shock had numbed her. But now. Now she was alive again. Alive enough to hurt. Alive enough to mourn. Hours later, thunder cracked across the plains, a rare winter storm sound. My Lynn jerked upright, her heart pounding. "Grant!" Her own voice startled her. The cabin answered only with the roar of the storm. Her breath trembled. She looked around the room. Empty bed. Empty chair. Empty doorway. The absence of him pressed so hard against her ribs she thought she might break under it. She stumbled to her feet and paced the room, clutching at her silk shawl. "Why did you leave so easily?" she whispered. "Why did I make you go?" Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the folded letter on the table. Mylin stared at it. "Henry!" Her voice cracked. "Why did you choose him? Why did you send him to me?" For the first time since reading the letter, she let herself imagine the truth not as betrayal, but as a gift. A final act of love from the man she'd lost, a way of guiding her toward something new. She sank into a chair, pressing her hands to her eyes. "I'm not angry because he lied," she realized. "I'm angry because I care. I'm angry because losing him hurts." The realization hit hard. A raw, relentless truth. She didn't want Grant gone. She wanted him back. The storm outside began to ease near dawn, its fury softening into scattered flakes. Mylin opened the door and stared into the grey horizon. The world smelled of wet earth and pine. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. Grant was somewhere out there, alone, walking through the cold, carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. She felt something fierce unfurl inside her. A courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I can't let him go," she whispered. The decision rose within her, steady as the sun. She would find him. She would tell him the truth of her heart. She would not lose a second man to the silence between words. Mylin packed her saddlebags with what little food she had left and filled her canteen. She strapped on her boots, pulled her heavy wool coat tight over her dress, and stepped outside. The ground squelched beneath her feet, patches of mud mixed with slush made the path uneven. Determination straightened her spine. She saddled her horse, a sturdy mare Henry had bought her, and swung up with more resolve than strength. The wind whipped across the plain, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a guide. She glanced back at the cabin. Small. Lonely. But no longer a prison. It was a place she would return to only when her heart was whole again. "Grant," she murmured, gripping the reins. "Wherever you are. Wait for me." Then she kicked gently, and her horse burst into motion, carrying her toward the ridge, toward the man she had driven away, and the love she refused to lose again. The prairie opened before Mylin in long ribbons of grey and silver, still wet from the night storm. Low clouds crawled across the sky, heavy and brooding, but the wind had eased to a quiet murmur. Her horse's hooves splashed through shallow puddles, scattering muddy water over the frost-bitten grass. She had never ridden this far alone, never beyond the ridge that separated her homestead from the outer territories. But today, the land didn't frighten her. The emptiness gave her direction. Hours passed.